Hi Cameron.
Hey.
First of all, thank you for having the opportunity to speak to you a little bit about you as an artist and your instrument, the international touring organ.
I should be thanking you.
The first question I have is, you have lived here in Berlin for quite a couple of years now, yeah, so you made Berlin as kind of your new hometown, but why did you decide to move here to Berlin? I guess it's not because of the very, very cold winter days like we have one today.
Well, we have cold days in New York too. I moved here from New York. I'd lived there for 10 years. I never really have a good answer to this question because I don't always understand why I moved myself. Obviously, there are certain reasons. I needed a change. I wanted to turn 30 in Europe. I obviously wanted to build this organ. It seemed strange to move to Germany to build an organ which ended up being built in America, and which is an all-American organ built for an American,
Definitely.
on an American tradition, and with an American technology. But I guess it comes probably down to just zeitgeist. I hate to use an overused word, but Berlin provides a certain combination of accessibility and freedom and people not messing with you.
Yeah.
And not particularly, getting in your business, which I, as a essentially withdrawn machine operator who works on his own most of the time, kind of somehow found attractive. And of course, ultimately, the cultural scene of Germany is important for an American to reckon with.
And you already mentioned this very special instrument, the international touring organ you invented, you created.
I would only have to correct you there. I didn't invent it. I caused it to be built by its inventor, a company called Marshall & Ogletree in Needham,
It was your
Massachusetts.
idea to get an instrument like that. And what was the purpose? What was your intention that led to that very instrument you play on nowadays?
Well, it's actually, as complicated as it must seem, it's a very simple outgrowth of my wish to simply be able to be disassociated from the systems of the pipe organ. And more importantly than from the pipe organ itself, or any one pipe organ, because they're all different, it's just that it was perfectly clear to me from about the time I was 16 that if I ever wanted to be part of the actual musical infrastructure of commercial music making in the world, the pipe organ would not be viable. However, I discovered along the way something which I didn't expect, which is that the deeper you delve into the subjects of the pipe organ and the digital organ, if you have a proper understanding of the informational identity and systems that make an organ, not the mystic stuff, not the wood and leather and metal stuff, not the what's up in the case, and not the history and the guys in the wigs and all that, but the simple binary mathematics, then you realize that the digital organ is not only a member of the pipe organ family, but it is foretold by the pipe organ and actually required by it, I think, in that the pipe organ has had a role to play, a huge role, in the development of the digital revolution.
Yeah.
So it's actually a natural outgrowth, and in that sense, along the way, I discovered that I vastly prefer the digital organ to the pipe organ, and for good or ill, I seem to be the first person in history willing to take that position. And the longer I stay there, the more strongly I believe it.
And the international touring organ, it looks very spectacular. This
It is
instrument,
quite spectacular.
A little bit like the control center of a starship or things like that. But how does it work, that whole system of that organ?
Well, every organ is a control system, and the console of every organ, great or small, on whatever principle it's arranged and in whatever style and from whatever period, is in fact a control interface. The business of starships is a touchy one because then we get into Gene Roddenberry and issues of fantasy. And that's only touchy for me not because I'm allergic to fantasy, but because it is the want of some people to portray my organ as a fantasy, or more accurately as a non-reality. When in reality, for me, the digital organ is the truest organ that there could be. I realize that might seem strange for somebody who's accustomed to, again, wood and metal things. But you have to remember that the purpose of an organ is not to have pipes. The purpose of an organ is to allow me to make you feel something. And in that sense, the mechanism is utterly irrelevant. It's the same principle, ultimately, you have to receive sound. The organ only exists at the instant and at the place at which your ear experiences it. There is no organ other than the organ that you experience in your perception of reality. And so, however grandiose and expensive and however many committees of creased forehead older white men are assembled to pronounce judgment on it, ultimately, the organ is literally, like beauty, it's in the mind of the beholder. And so our obsession should be with the precision, the articulation, the accuracy, the beauty, and the individuality of the sound, and, more importantly from my standpoint, the degree of resolution over which I have at which I have control of the component parts that allow you to experience music. In that sense, the organ is utterly traditional. What you see when you walk into a concert hall where we've installed the ITO is the impression, as you say, is spectacular. That's partly because of the sound system. The sound system is a slightly different discussion, but when we're talking about the console, that organ is an organ that is essentially an updated extension of a tradition of organ building that existed from about 1890 to the onset of World War II in America. And there's nothing on that console, basically, that an organist who played in a big city church and maybe afternoons at a theater in the 1920s or 30s wouldn't recognize. Except perhaps for the pedal board, which has 10 notes more than any other organ in the world. But the organ, this organ is a paradox only in that, on one hand, it's a radical technology, but that technology is applied to utterly traditional means, which is why I consider it a highly traditional organ.
But has the touring organ changed anything between or in the relationship between you and your instrument? Because you don't have to change your instrument on every venue, so you are able to play the same instrument every time.
The thing is, I'm always at pains to point out that the reasons that we will discuss and the benefits that are many, as true as they are and as important as they are to me, are always secondary to the fact that I just like that organ better. That's the organ I want to record on. That's the organ I want to own. That's the organ I designed. It's the organ of my dreams. How is it somehow an affront, as it so often is implied, to the pipe organ, to exult in the pipe organ and to commemorate and honor the pipe organ by assembling an organ out of the best parts of various pipe organs in a way which flies in the face of the intentions of those builders and on purpose. In a sense, my design of this organ I think of as an extension of the intellectual activity that happens when, at any organ, mine or others, I have to first decide which stops to use. You know, there's a weird thing about the organ, which, unlike the piano, you or I can sit at the piano and play a note and the piano will sound. That's not the case in the organ. The organ is, in a sense, intellectually an anti-spontaneous instrument because before you can play sound, before you can generate sound, you have to select which sounds will be in use, which means that regardless of the design of the organ and regardless of tradition, every organ, also regardless of the intention of the person playing it, it's just almost an equational thing. Every organ is defined by the selections of the person playing it. And the folly of
registration.
Registration is what we call it. But registration, when we say registration, what we think of is what did Dupré write at the beginning of the piece, these little words, and we have to somehow interpret that into what the modern organ is. But it's much more than that. As an organist, I think sometimes, I don't think, it's very clear in the way that organists operate. For instance, in the way that academic organists value the way which, the degree to which the instructions of registration will be slavishly followed. For instance, in music by César Franck, even though César Franck was writing for an organ which was not only unique at the time, but which no longer really exists in its form. Nevertheless, these onerous debates will occur about what to do. But you have to realize that, these debates will occur in sort of contra the fact that organists are also somehow expected and seem to want to have a kind of retiring anti-ego. Don't look, I'm in the organ balcony, you don't see me, I have my back to the audience at the very least, I'm doing what the composer intended. Please don't fool yourself. Before the audience can hear the organ, before the organ can operate functionally as information, and as an informational system, which it is, the organist has to decide which sounds to use. And that means that regardless of the design, the organist, not the organ, defines our psychological impression of the identity of the instrument. And that will have to be true. It is true every time the organ is heard, for every organ and for every organist. And without understanding that, it's not really possible to see that, for me, the idea of taking the best parts of various organs, famous and not, and assembling an organ that could not exist as a physical pipe organ, and never will, and which in fact contains sounds from different organs by different organ builders, some of whom hated each other and would have never worked together. Nevertheless, what I'm asserting in this, overtly, is that the organist is a person of higher authority, essentially that the buck, musically, may not and should not stop with the organ builder. We have an unhealthy situation, I think, in the world now of the academic organ, and you see it very much in the concert hall organ in Europe, I'm very sorry to say. It's very much to your detriment over here, that organ builders essentially are the ones who decide what organs get built. Well, the organ builder is the last person you want to decide what organ should be built. It's the organ builder who should build, without questioning and without a great deal of discussion, exactly what it is that the organist wants, and that is the proposition behind the International Touring Organ. And that is why I have had the audacity to essentially go up to certain organs by organ building masters and say, in acknowledging that you're an organ building master who created this great work of art, I'm now going to simply take parts of it and assemble something which is entirely outside the ken of what you intended, because as an organist, that is what I do anyway with registration, and I'm now going to do it on a macro scale with the instruments themselves. And that's what that organ is, and for that reason it is outside the criticisms of what constitutes a great pipe organ, because it allows us to do things that a pipe organ could never do. Yeah. In the same way, by the way, to mix my metaphors perhaps slightly, you have to remember that when Rachmaninoff wrote his third concerto, which is now played by 15-year-olds all over the world, the only person who really could play it other than him was the young Vladimir Horowitz. Should that mean, therefore, as it was probably said at the time, and as I think it was said, for instance, about Marcel Dupre's Preludes and Fugues, which were thought unplayable at the time, simply because they were beyond the technical level of the organists of the day, should that mean, oh, well, then you shouldn't write a piece, as was ridiculously said to me by Michael Barone of American Public Media's Pipe Dreams once, it would be really better if you wrote music that people could play. Should one really take that seriously? Is that how a keyboarding art advances? Is that how organ building advances? I think not. You don't do high-level laser surgery with a wonderful old historic sword. It's a great thing. I have nothing against old historic swords. Restore them, polish them up, and hang it on the wall. But when it comes time for surgery, I'll take the laser, thank you.
And coming back to the International Touring Organ, has this very instrument or the possibilities of the instruments, have they affected the way you play the organ in the sense of you have more freedom because you are very familiar with this instrument?
Well, it's a Sisyphusian thing. I mean, of course I have more freedom in the moment because I have an organ which reaches the absolute limits of every possible kind of dynamic expression in tone color, but within an integrated system. It's not just an open-ended thing. The design of that organ is as fixed and as locked down as any pipe organ you might meet. We change it all the time, but pipe organs get changed all the time and revoiced too. That doesn't delegitimize the idea of a fixed system. But in terms of the freedom that it gives me, this is a kind of, I don't know what the mathematical term for it, whether it's Gaussian, but it's one of those things where if you adjust one aspect of the equation, the other part moves. Because of course I have more freedom, but I also have the responsibility for husbanding and taking care of and maintaining and keeping before the public and paying for a colossally expensive, basically a moving building. And a highly sophisticated supercomputer system which needs constant and specific maintenance. So I'm not proposing that the International Touring Organ is the model for the future organ, but it's absolutely incontestable because of the existence of such a system and because of the infinite reproducibility, theoretically, of computers and data. The proof of concept is already there that the organ of the future could be globally standardized in the same way as the piano. It could be done so in a way which not only doesn't fly in the face of the organ tradition, but which gives rise to ever greater technical possibilities and ever more accomplished virtuoso organists, for the same reason that people find remarkable some of the things that I do. None of that stuff was developed on the pipe organ.
I definitely understand, but unfortunately we are at the end of our conversation, so...
Some people might feel that's fortunate, but I have to say thank you for giving me such a great platform and being generous with your time.
All the best for you and for your international touring organ.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Thank you.